The letter to James is probably the earliest New Testament book, sometimes referred to as the first New Testament book. Even though it's found way at the back of the New Testament, it was one of the earliest ones written while the church was still quite Jewish. In some respects, it's not the first letter of the New Testament, it may be the last letter of the Old Testament. Now I know it's placed in the New Testament, but it's dealing with themes in a very Hebraic way of thinking. James wrestles with this issue of faith and actions. And sometimes the book of James is set in contrast to the book of Galatians. I'm going to maybe offer a different idea there. James was written by James, the brother of Jesus, and that is important because he was one of those that rejected Christ before his resurrection. And then the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that James saw the risen Savior, and that's when he believed. And he becomes a leader in the church. And, can you imagine being the brother of Jesus and being someone that other people would find a high deal of respect and what you have to live up to? Well, James lived up to it. He was known as a very pious and righteous man. And he was the pastor of the first pastor of the church in the church there in Jerusalem, and was seen as kind of one of the most important members of the entire Christian world. We find him in the book of Acts. He's already a leader of the church by that time in Acts chapter 15 at the council that decided that Gentiles did not need to be Jews. That's important to remember, especially in light of this particular book and some of the charges that some have made against it. Probably written in the mid, maybe even early 40s. My personal belief is probably around 43 or 44 when you look at a timetable of the events that took place before and after, and when these things take place. It definitely takes place before the Jerusalem Council and before James's own death, which is in 62 AD. James is written to Jewish Christians, and probably Jewish Christians outside of Jerusalem. The largest community is in Antioch at this point that we're aware of. And so it could have been he was writing to the Antioch church, which would be interesting if the Apostle Paul was already there by that time or would soon come there and could have received the letter. And that's what makes me wonder if James was not influential on Paul in writing Galatians, because Galatians picks up the same themes that James does. And some have seen a contrast between the two, but I think it's really just a continuation or an explanation of what James is trying to communicate, especially if Paul later met James and was able to talk to him face to face. He may be clarifying James's teachings. It's that faith is to be lived out in our actions. That's the main purpose of this book. How do you live out your faith? Don't say you believe and that's it. Say you believe and then show it by how you live. If you say you love people, treat them well. If you see someone who's hungry, don't just say, well, God bless you, and then leave it at that. No, you tend to their needs. And that's the idea of James. Put your faith into practice. And that's really in agreement with Galatians, in agreement with Hebrews and the other books of the New Testament. It talks about there's wisdom is needed to live out your faith. In fact, there are 108 verses and more than 50 imperatives. So half of the verses, it seems like, has an imperative, a command, how you're supposed to live. He deals with three main issues: wisdom, trials and temptations, and the relationship of the poor to the rich. And in these, there's an alternation that's taking place. The first chapter deals with these twice each, and then we see in reverse order dealing with those in chapters 2 through chapter 5. And so it talks about how we as Christians should live. Very practical issues, especially in light of the coming of Christ, and that we will have a day of judgment for ourselves. And it engages the relationship between faith and works. Some people have charged that James is a works-based righteousness, and that's not the case at all. In fact, James himself says several times that justification comes by faith, but that your faith has to be indicated in your actions. The outline for James is it starts off with the testing of your faith. It talks about in James 1 through verse 2 through verse 18, and I think there's two different scenarios there where he's talking about those three issues I brought up earlier: trials, wisdom, and the relationship of the rich to the poor. And then he talks about faith and obedience, and he looks at those issues again with a summary. And I think verse 27 may be the key to understanding the whole book. He talks about what true religion is, and it's to take care of the poor, to take care of the widows, and take care of the foreigners. He talks about the sin of partiality, the sin of passivity, that you're guilty if you don't do anything. Just not doing the wrong thing is wrong, of course, but not doing the right thing is equally bad. He talks about how we should be wise in our speech, and that sin can creep in if we're not careful, and our tongue can become a powerful tool for destruction. And we all know that whatever powerful tools are in the world, the tongue can be just as powerful, if not more deadly, and destroy people. He talks about the role of wisdom in obedience, and then he talks about faith in real life, faith in desires, your passions and lusts, and how to control those, faith in your relationships, faith in the future, how to control faith in your finances. Again, remember, he's addressing the issue of poverty and wealth. And so he talks about how faithful people who are rich will live and conduct themselves and care for those who are suffering. And then he goes on and talks about suffering. And then he finally finishes with prayer and talks about those who are faithful have an effective prayer. And that some people may not be effective in their prayer life. It could be because they're not faithful. And then he concludes with how we as Christians should conduct ourselves and live. It's an important book for us to realize that our faith is not just something that's supposed to be mental up in our minds, but it's supposed to be lived out. And many times people call Christians hypocrites. Many times people recognize, hey, they don't live any different than we do, and too often they're right. And that's a bad charge against Christians. We should be different. We should treat people better. We should expect people to look at us and say, hey, I need help, and we could help them. And so that's an important letter of James. Something we should never forget. And I think should be an important letter for us to not ignore. A lot of times it gets ignored at the end of the books of the New Testament. It should be a book that is lived out on a regular basis.